So,
Sure.
so basically, welcome everybody. This is a Meet the Author Be Women Solutions webinar, and what we would like to share with you is that Be Women has really incorporated the term caring economy that it was coined by Riane Eisler. And basically, Be Women is a network of women entrepreneur and intrapreneur that seek to balance the purpose and profits in the markets, all towards a caring economy. And that as an economic system that genuinely cares for the well-being and fulfillment of people and respect and responsibility of the environment. And as a group, we have a very specific objective of measuring our goals. And here we have Riane, our very special guest today, and Rosi. So without further ado, please, Rosi and Riane, the line is all yours.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. So it is my pleasure to introduce Riane Eisler to you, and thank you so much for joining us today to discuss Nurturing Our Humanity, Riane's latest book. And Riane Eisler is a social systems scientist and cultural historian. She's also an attorney, and her research and 12 books over the last 45 years have transformed the lives of people worldwide. Riane's newest book is Nurturing Our Humanity, the book that we'll be discussing today, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future. And she co-authored this book and published it last year out of Oxford University Press with Douglas Frye. Dr. Eisler is the president of the Center for Partnership Studies, which was founded in 1987 when her book, The Chalice and the Blade, came out. The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, has sold over 500,000 copies worldwide, is in 47 foreign editions, and is in its 50th printing. She also, in 2007, published the book, The Real Wealth of Nations, and her dozen books have spanned the concept that she put forward in her first book, The Chalice and the Blade, which is the partnership domination social scale that draws the distinction between systems, be they economic, political, how they are oriented either towards domination or towards partnership. And so today we'll be discussing the neuroscience. We'll do an overview of these systems and the neuroscience of how our early childhood experiences really form how we end up creating systems as adults, whether they are political or economic systems. So with that, welcome, Riane. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Rosi and Laura. It's wonderful to be with you.
It's always good to be with you. So Riane, the first thing that I would love to ask you about is, of these dozen books that you've written, many of them you spent 5 to 10 years researching, and you wrote them on your own. I'm curious, you wrote this book with the anthropologist Douglas Frye. What did you see was possible in partnering with him in co-authoring Nurturing Our Humanity?
Well, I actually worked on this book for 7 years before I invited Doug to join me as co-author. But he is an anthropologist and the leading authority on foraging societies, which is how we humans lived for millennia in our prehistory. And he calls them the original partnership societies. So he brings a lot of research, a lot of knowledge to the table. He also knows quite a bit about neuroscience. And as you mentioned, Nurturing Our Humanity really was replete with studies from neuroscience supporting actually the conceptual framework introduced in my work of the domination partnership social scale, and supporting these new configurations that transcend conventional categories such as right, left, religious, secular, etc., that really are very important to understand if we are to move forward, which requires looking at some of these very foundational matters.
And with Nurturing Our Humanity being your latest book, and I did the math, your research all the way back to your 10 years of researching Chalice and the Blade really does go back about 45 years.
Yes,
So
it does.
it does. And this book is really a synthesis of that entire body of work plus new information. I'm curious, what was the biggest discovery that you personally had in writing this book?
Well, I have been interested in neuroscience for a long time, but as we all know, it sort of arrives in sort of bits and pieces. Rather, there's this headline about, oh, we just found out such and such about the human brain, or for me, the biggest discovery was what I said, that actually neuroscience really debunks, number one, much of the old story about, quote, human nature, which we address in Nurturing Our Humanity. What it shows is what many of us really know, that humans have a built-in yearning for caring, connection, and that if anything, all things being equal, which they're not if you grow up in a system that orients to the domination system, we humans actually receive biochemical rewards of pleasure, not so much when we win, but when we share and care. And the validation of a human, quote, nature that needs a certain kind of environment to find expression is, I think, a very important thing for humans and for everyone to understand, because what we know is that the nature-nurture argument is a non-issue. The real issue for us is gene expression. We have capacities for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, but we also have capacities for insensitivity, cruelty, violence, and destructiveness. But we know today, and this is really one of the major findings that is really documented in Nurturing Our Humanity, is that whether or not we express our positive capacities or our negative capacities largely depends on the interaction. In fact, almost completely really depends on our environment, the interaction of our brains, which are very flexible, with our environments, which for humans, of course, are cultural primarily, as mediated first through families, education, religion, politics, then economics, and so forth. So this book has some very clear messages, but 1/3 of the book is really devoted to documentation, to citations of studies. So it's really an easy book to read, despite its subject, but it's also a very well documented work.
I'm curious, what is one of the most striking studies that you discovered in this research? And before you answer that to the ladies on this call, if you have a question, please feel free to write it into the chat box, and we'll discuss them as we go along in the conversation. So Riane, what was one of the most striking research studies that you discovered in your research?
Well, there was a study of men. I mean, there were so many of them, really. It's a cumulative effect. But the one that jumps to mind is a study of men that have a certain gene that has been associated with a predisposition for violence, a propensity, higher propensity for violence. However, what the researchers found is that not all men who have this gene become violent, antisocial, that only those that had what we today know are adverse childhood experiences. Now, the ACEs studies, I'm going to jump to that for a moment, show that, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, that were published in their longitudinal studies covering many, many years, decades, show that people who have these adverse childhood experiences, starting in their families, have very adverse health, including mental health consequences, but they also show something that we really have to pay heed to, and people are beginning to pay heed to, which is how frequent these experiences are. And if you look at them from using the domination partnership social scale, you see that they are actually related directly to the requirements of a domination system to maintain its basic top-down character. And this said, the good news is how many people are beginning to talk about trauma. I think of domination systems as trauma factories. The bad news is that there's still relatively low awareness of the fact that this doesn't just happen by accident. This happens because of traditions of domination that are transmitted from generation to generation. And I'm going to stop here because that was a long answer.
I want to come back to the long-term effects of the adverse childhood experiences. If you have your copy of your book for everyone on this call, if you look at page 116, it discusses the global pandemic of violence against children. Riane, could you talk a little bit about that? Like we see here in the book, it talks about child sexual abuse, child marriage, the child sex trade and sexual slavery, female genital mutilation, violence against children in schools, violence against children in homes. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, strangely, and it's really very peculiar, the field of human rights has only in the last decades begun to focus on really the pandemic of human rights violations, and yes, abuse and violence of the majority of humanity, women and children. Much of it, unfortunately, as part of domination cultural traditions. And I have been a pioneer in this area. In addition to my background in social and systems science, I'm also an attorney. And in 1987, I wrote the first article in the Human Rights Quarterly on what was later to be called women's rights as human rights. You know, you'd think it's obvious, but believe me, in 1987, if that was the first article on it, you can imagine that it was not part of either human rights theory or action. Today, it very much has become that, although it is still marginalized. I mean, I still remember a conversation I had with a human rights luminary before I wrote this article, because it was like, oh my gosh, I mean, how blind can people be? But they can be very, very blind. I brought up things like genital mutilation, you know, cultural practices that are socially, religiously, etc., condoned. and perpetuate it. And he said, oh, well, that's very sad. But, you know, I have to really, this is what he said to me, I have to focus on the important things, like torture of political prisoners. And I thought, if you don't understand that we're torturing women and children worldwide, and that this is, and this was before I knew the neuroscience of how this actually is directly connected, yes, with torture of political prisoners. You know, if people accept human rights violations in their own families, why wouldn't they accept them against strangers? You know, it stands to reason, doesn't it? But it's taken a long time, and I have actually proposed in an article that I wrote in a Cambridge University Press book, which of course, unfortunately, very few people read, and there's been no follow-up in terms of action. I'm looking for an organization to take this up, which is to really pressure the United Nations to include, to change the Rome Statute, which is the statute on really egregious violations of human rights, to include two categories which are absent: gender and childhood. You know, we have race, certainly we should. We have ethnicity, certainly we should. But again, so-called educated people come to this very honestly, because I woke up too at a certain point in my life to realize that in all my years of so-called higher education, there had been hardly anything by, about, or for people like me, women. We have been taught to marginalize. I mean, it's only 50 years ago that we even had women's studies, and then men's studies, and then gender studies, and they're still marginalized in the academy, you know, off to one side, rather. And as far as child development and the neuroscience, that too, it's in an occasional psychology class, in a neuroscience class. It should be part of sociology, political science, everything. So this is something I'm very passionate about.
Thank you, Riane. I'm Elizabeth Subale. Elizabeth, it's good to see you again on this. Thank you so much for joining us again. Elizabeth writes, trauma factories. She says, how true. In many ancient societies, they knew that the best way to create aggressive male warriors was to separate them very early from their mothers, often as infants. She says, glad we're aware today of the importance of having a healthy bond between mothers and babies. And then she says, what do you think about the recent research into oxytocin and its importance in developing healthy social abilities such as empathy?
The recent research into what?
Oxytocin,
oxytocin. I didn't, yes. Well, yes, that's part of what we're finding out from neuroscience. As I said, that there are certain chemicals which our bodies naturally produce, such as oxytocin, that make for bonding. But I want to say something. Yes, it's true that many mothers are caring, but they're also very, unfortunately, look, like genital mutilation, it's performed mostly by women. The Chinese foot binding, it was done by mothers to their own daughters, despite the horrible pain, globs of flesh falling off. I mean, so this is not a question that women are better than men, or women against men or men against women. It's reclaiming everyone's humanity by changing the system. And as long as we have this top-down domination system, we're beginning with the ranking of the male form of humanity over the female form. Difference is equated with superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated. being served or serving, children internalize this template that then is applied to all in-group versus out-group thinking, whether it's based on race, religion, ethnicity, you know, whether it's
Damn, bitch, you ugly as
anti-Semitism.
fuck, old fuck.
What?
Whoa.
We have some interlopers into our call here.
Well, what shall we do? Can you get rid of them?
Hang on. Laura, can you mute everyone, please?
Yo, hey, Rosi, where you at?
I'm coughing already.
What is happening is that we are having, yeah.
And Danielle.
Ain't no cap. I bet my cum could fix those wrinkles.
Bro, shut the
I
fuck
think we
up
have to
already.
leave, Laura, and maybe we can come back.
Nigga,
because
nigga, 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 nigga.
interference.
Miss, what are we doing?
Danielle,
Oh,
estás haciendo algo
Laura, you old
mal.
bitch. I'll make you come in 3 seconds.
Ay, ay, ay. Oh, we've never had that, have we? Some silly.
I'm so sorry about this. Ridiculous.
Bitch, speak English.
Who was that?
Riane, it's people, young people
Rosi
who
leaked
are
it.
having a joke. Laura, can you mute everybody? Okay.
Laura, you better not mute me, you fat bitch. You fat old bitch.
Oh, really? You speak
Yeah.
English. Hablas inglés, pero tú eres muy.
Is the fact that how important kids' brains are and how malleable they are. But you mentioned something very specific, that is, it's kids' brains are very malleable, but then all their future is it seems like is based on what happens during
these formative years.
Yeah.
Well, these are formative years, as Lubna said. But this said, people change their feelings, their thoughts, their actions, and this involves changes in the brain. So the flexibility of the human brain continues. However, and it's a big however, it takes a lot of work.
Yes.
to make the changes. I mean, whole fields, psychology, psychotherapy, counseling have sprung up to really help people reverse some of the damage that was done in their early years. Now, the point of nurturing our humanity is, well, let's start early. But to do that, we have to take certain actions, and we have to pay attention, real attention, to matters that are ignored in conventional progressive politics. As I said, so-called women's issues and children's issues, while we're hearing more about them, it's still off to one side. People don't have what this work offers, which is the framework to connect the dots, to see that politics and economics are directly related to families, to religion, to education. And this is our job. This is our job to really, first of all, become aware ourselves, and consciousness can change. You know, I mean, it has changed enormously, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be burnt at the stake or something, right? So, you know, but it's up to us, those of us who care and who are beginning to really make their voices heard, our voices heard. And it can be done.
totally. I'm so honored to be here with you, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
But do you think it's a matter of reversing, or is it a matter of being able to take a step back and see that your life is also a matter of perception and response to any set of circumstances, and be able to evaluate a different way of seeing it, or a different way of interpreting it, or responding to it, or somehow putting it into a glass box so it's not that it didn't happen?
Well, I think that it really starts with changes in our perceptions. You're quite right. Changes in consciousness. You know, there's a chapter in Nurturing Our Humanity called Expanding or Contracting Consciousness. Domination systems contract our consciousness, don't they? In many ways. I mean, studies show, for example, that people who have this very rigid domination childhood have their brains actually are the part that helps us adjust to rapid change don't work as well. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't be trained or that they can't eventually see the change. But, you know, there was a study, actually I have to tell you about it because it was done by Else Frankel-Brunswick in the 40s. She was a psychologist and developed the F for fascist scale. And she found that, among other things, that people from these very rigid domination-oriented families, if you showed them a series of slides of a dog slowly becoming a cat, it took them, I mean, eventually they could see the cat, eventually, but it took them forever to really be able to accept. It was, as Frankel-Brunswick wrote, it's almost as if a voice of authority in their minds said, this is a dog. Finished.
Yeah.
And there were studies done by psychologists and neuroscientists by the name of Amadio and his team showing what I just mentioned, that the part of our brain that helps us adjust to change really doesn't work as well. It's smaller. And we see that, of course, writ large in climate change denial, right? In the denial, unfortunately, that so many people still are in, of the connection between, on the importance of childhood and gender, not only personally, but socially, in a planetary way. So it's up to us to change these patterns. And for me, the so-called revolution in consciousness is the real issue is waking from what I call the domination trance. And we all come by that trance very, very honestly, especially those of us who are, quote, educated, who've gone to college and who've been indoctrinated that anything connected with the majority of humanity, women and children, is either to be ignored or it's marginal.
Yes.
I mean, we really have to understand that we've all been brought up to and we have to change the academy, and that's very difficult because people get their perks for perpetuating the old, quote, important knowledge.
I keep talking about being obsessed with this hierarchy, and we look at each other up and down, if they're better than I or richer than myself, or even when we console each other, look how much worse others are. And with partnerism, you bring us back to being a universe of you and me, each of us having, in every relationship, it's a partnership in some way. How did you find yourself to discover it and to be so eloquent at structuring it to give such a framework? And I'm not surprised that it's been it's taken so long because it's so common sense and
yeah, but we don't have time. Look at what's happening.
Exactly.
The COVID-19 is really an opportunity. The normal, the old normal, is crumbling, and people keep talking about going back to normal. And I'm saying, really? I mean, in the rich United States, 1/4 of all children lived in poverty.
Well,
is this the normal you want to go back to? No, we have to create a new normal. And that's where all of us come in. I can't do it by myself. You can't do it by yourself. But what we're launching, and please come to our Partnerism Participatory Summit on the 20th of this month, because we're launching a Make Partnerism Mainstream campaign. And that's what we have to do. And it isn't going to be easy, but it better be quick.
Speaking of mainstream, I want to go to the topic of economic policies and social policies. And before we had that interruption, we were talking about adverse childhood experiences. What is the result of adverse childhood experiences, and how does that connect to the type of policies that we end up with as adults?
Well, I'll just really cut to what we have, which, among other things, is a gendered system of values. Because if you start with this model of humanity, right, where one form of humanity, there are only two basic forms. There's quite a bit in between. I mean, the fluidity of gender is a very important movement. If we understand that this is nothing new. No, there have always been people who have had other sexual identities, other gender identities, but the fact that we're talking about it is important. But if you start with that and you see that it's not coincidental that whether it was Hitler in Germany, Stalin in the former Soviet Union, Khomeini in Iran, the Taliban, ISIS, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, etc., for them, a top priority always is either maintaining or going back to what they like to call a, quote, traditional family. What is that? An authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. And that is a foundational to domination systems. So if we really want to change the system, we have to address foundations. And these are two foundations. But there's also the economic system, which of course really perpetuates this gendered system of values. So there's, in the domination mind, you asked about policies. There's always money for prisons. What is that? That's the punitive male head of household, isn't it? And there's always money for weapons, for wars. What is that? That's the archetype of the domination archetype, not human, domination archetype of the hero as killer. But somehow there isn't enough money for caring for children, for childcare, for health care, for elder care. If you really use this lens, you see that it really all goes back, doesn't it, to the kinds of what children experience and observe early on. This ranking of the so-called masculine, because it's only domination masculine. You can't be a real man if you are like a woman. Real men, the one distinguishing feature of the, quote, real man in a domination system is that he is in no way like a woman, or he's a wimp, he's a pussy, he's, I mean, and women and men perpetuate that. So yes, it's all connected. Policy is not something that comes out of thin air. It perpetuates a certain system of values. And if you have families, as you do in much of the world still today, where women are basically male-controlled technologies of production and reproduction, right? As well as sexual objects, they're only instrumental rather than full-fledged humans. You will continue to have what you've got. And so when people talk about racism in the United States, I point to Shia versus Sunni, Sunni versus Shia. It's the same, it's in-group versus out-group. The in-group and the out-group change, but it's the same. And not coincidentally, in these cultures or subcultures, if you really look at them, they're domination cultures. Top-down rankings of domination, hierarchies of domination in both the family and the state or tribe. Rigid gender stereotypes with the ranking of anything considered, quote, masculine over anything considered soft or feminine. And of course, lots of abuse and violence because it's necessary to maintain, ultimately, fear and force maintain these rankings. And the stories, we have to change the stories and the language, because linguistic psychologists have so often told us that the categories provided by a culture's language channel our thinking. So that, and it's very true of social categories, so it's almost impossible to visualize anything else. And that's why it's so important that we start talking about partnerism, about the domination partnership scale, a social scale, a family scale, an educational scale. It applies in every institution. We have to change the language. And it's not easy, by the way, as I said, but we better do it. As I said, it better be quick.
But can you expand a little bit more about the issue of violence? Because in your book, you really, for many centuries, people thought that humans were innate violent itself. But you say there are previous cultures that were not warmongers as current cultures or in the last 10,000 years. Why is that? Is it because it's just culture? Violence is cultural in their brains, or is learned?
Well, it's both. I mean, we have the capacity for violence, obviously, but it has to be reinforced and it has to be learned. So, I mean, the work of Douglas Frye is really very important here. He's published extensively on not only contemporary foraging societies, but also the archaeological evidence. There are no signs of destruction through warfare until at the earliest, 10,000 years ago. Now, out of the millennia of human cultural evolution, that's huge. But see, when you say people used to think, unfortunately, there are still people, including scholars, who think that. You know, in The Chalice and the Blade, I talk about the Minoan civilization of Crete and how there are no signs of fortifications or any signs of warfare between the various city-states. Well, some archaeologists have gone crazy trying to disprove that. But they always start, and if you read their work, it's fascinating, they start with the premise that war is just, quote, human nature. That's been with us forever. And that premise is wrong. it is erroneous, it is false. So that's one of the salient messages from the evidence that is in Nurturing Our Humanity. But there's so much more in that book because it really describes the process of either becoming the kind of person that fits into a partnership system or that fits into a domination system. And that's what we have to really pay attention to and change the foundations so that less and less people fit into domination systems. Because think about it, people who grow up in domination systems, for them there's only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. There is no partnership alternative. And our language, our gender-specific language, matriarchy and patriarchy, embodies that assumption, doesn't it? Either fathers are in control or mothers are in control. It's two sides of a domination coin, isn't it? So there is no partnership alternative, right? So this is one of the reasons that we really have to pay attention to changing language. And language does change. We can make it change.
I was talking with someone today who's a senior political strategist, and he was speaking to so many of the points of what your work is about, but he didn't have the language to fill in the gaps, to make the connections. And I was really excited to introduce him to your work because the language that you put forward really does fill in those gaps so that we can have a conversation that moves things forward. And he's going to come to the summit next week. And on that note, a reminder to everyone on this call, we're doing the participation summit on partnerism next Thursday, August 20th from 3 to 5 Eastern. The link is in the top of the chat box, and I can grab it again and post it as well. We have time, I think, for one or two more questions. Lubna, you have some great questions. I know you've been really excited to talk with Riane. Would you like to come off of mute and ask another question?
Also, Elizabeth is there with a hands up.
Oh, great. Let's go to Elizabeth.
I just want to say that I was really thinking about you yesterday, Riane, when I read the announcements about Kamala Harris being chosen as a vice president nominee. I was really struck because I'm pretty sure it was one of Joe Biden's tweets where he specifically said that he was very happy to welcome her as his partner. And I thought, well, there it is, there it is, a small step of the change that we need to see. What did you think about it?
Well, I think that it's remarkable considering how she attacked him in the debates. On the other hand, I think it was probably a wise choice because not only is she well known and she's Black and she's a woman, but she's also somebody who I can just see a debate between her and Pence. I mean, she is able to hold her own, to put it mildly. But at this point, I think that our job is to help, and I love that he's using the term partner. The Jennifer Siebel Newsom, the wife of the governor of California, chose to call herself first partner, not first lady. So we're making some inroads. I mean, Jennifer was very conscious. Biden, who knows, but the language is beginning to filter in, and that is good.
And we have another question here from Jennifer Mila. She says, which should be the language used at the family scale? So what should be in changing language around the family, how do we do that?
Well, first of all, that's a very good question, because traditional really means a more egalitarian family. I mean, this is how we lived for, thousands and thousands of years. were what people call in anthropology alloparenting, where not just the mother and the father parented, but the whole group, you know, parented. Just taking care of a child was what people did. I don't know. What do you all think? I mean, traditional is such a powerful word. I think the partnership family. How about that? The partnerism family, just like that. I mean, just let's get the word partnerism going. A partnerism family, which does not mean that there are no hierarchies, but there are hierarchies of actualization. We need parents, we need teachers, we need managers, we need leaders, we need, but power is not power to control and punish, right? But it's power to empower rather than disempower.
Asha Murphy says, I like the point that the language of patriarchy and matriarchy both have dominance. She says, I come from a community that is matriarchal, but that still has one side dominating another.
But the human community isn't matriarchal. If you look at these ancient societies, to call them matriarchal because women were not subordinated to men is a mistake. It's an error. They were more partnership oriented rather than domination oriented, so that both women and men could flourish. And this lasted for a long time. I mean, in The Chalice and the Blade, I write about a culture called Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, in Turkey, where, as the archaeologists who excavated there noted, I mean, not only are there no signs of destruction through warfare for 1,000 years, but the grave goods and the houses show no huge gaps between somebody on top and somebody on bottom. But as Ian Hodder, who excavated there, wrote, there are no signs that being born female or male really made any difference in your status in life. That is what we want to recreate, not to go back to any good old days, quote unquote, but to move forward. And we have to. We absolutely have to, because the in-group versus out-group thinking with our level of technological development, nuclear bombs, nuclear terrorism, germ warfare, germ terrorism, it's unsustainable. It simply is, not to speak of the once hallowed conquest or domination of nature, which is also unsustainable. So this, it's not just COVID that is showing the structural faults in an economic system where the essential workers are those that do care work, child care, health care, caring for a healthy environment, making sure that we have food, and yet these are not highly rewarded, if they're rewarded at all. I mean, the system is crazy, and we have to set it right side up. And we can, once we recognize that it is built on faulty premises that both Adam Smith and Karl Marx perpetuated by just calling they caring for people, for them was just women's work to be done for free in a male-controlled household. So for them, it was just reproductive rather than productive, right? Have to leave that behind. It's still being taught in our universities. We have to change that.
So but with that, oh, yes.
No, I was going to say, but we can do it.
We can do it. Yes. With that, we are at the top of the hour, and so we will wrap up and say thank you so much for coming today. Please join us at the Participation Summit on Partnerism next Thursday, August 20th from 3 to 5 p.m. I've put the link in the chat box to register for that. Riane, any last words before we sign off?
Well, I'm counting on you to really make partnerism mainstream. And
give us a list of the things like change how we raise our kids. What are your 5 things that you would say, these are the things that must be done by every woman, at least that is online?
Well, first of all, I think that I'll back up a little, because I think that we still socialize children to be boys and to be girls with sort of rigid gender stereotypes, and that has to stop. Men and women need to really be able to express their full humanity, so that if a boy is sensitive, he's not a wimp, and if a girl is assertive, she's not a ball breaker or a bitch or whatever it is, you know. Certainly, physical discipline of children is a legacy of domination systems. Even the American Psychological Association a couple of years ago finally came out with a statement saying that not only is physical discipline, you know, spanking, for example, ineffective, because kids who are spanked a lot become what people today call bad children, right? Rebellious, etc., violent. Sure, they learn that violence is a way to impose your will on others, right? But that it is harmful. It's an adverse childhood experience that damages our brains. So that is the second thing. Once we get rid of the gender stereotypes, and we get rid of this idea that it's all mom's fault if things don't work out, right? Which we do in our culture, you know. Then we can really have both, you know, both women and men care for children. It's very important because we're modeling behavior, aren't we? So, I mean, if we start with those 3 things, I think we've got a good chance. And of course, caring touch, and that caring connection. That's so important for us as humans. And in domination systems, as I mentioned earlier, caring is really confounded and connected with coercion, isn't it? You know, you get love if you do what you're told, right? And yes, children need limits. Of course they do. In the 60s, we confuse rebellion, you know, so-called permissive child rearing, for reconstruction. Today, we know better. We want authoritative rather than authoritarian parenting. So I think that makes 5, doesn't it?
Yes, that's a lot to do, but I think it's great. And I think this, all these suggestions are fantastic. So on this, I would like to thank you, Riane, so much for giving this opportunity of having practically all your books on these webinars and discussions. And this way we will continue perpetuating in every talk we do in Be Women Solutions, all your philosophies and principles and ideas of a partnership, of partnerism society.
And I'd like to ask you all to write about this, write op-eds, write for your journals, write for your community blogs. You know, the only way that things change is if our voices are heard and read. Because these books, you know, how did socialism become mainstream? People really read. They read Marx. They read and read and discussed. So discussion, book circles are very important. And I trust that you will change the world, which is what this is all about.
Thank you very, very much. And so on this note, I would like to thank you all for